Now in the news is the historic auto workers strike. See whether it's any of those things, historic, auto workers, or a strike, today on the 10th Man. There have been historic auto workers strikes in the past. There was the Battle of the Overpass at Ford, the great sit-down strike at General Motors. Those two have names. But what makes this one historic? The 1998 strike at GM, for example, was historic for destroying the components industry and perhaps as the last illegal strike. It shaped much of what's happening now. Back then, the union was so strong it laughed at the law and the labor contract. They went on strike anytime they wanted just by saying the factory was unsafe. Then they would demand changes to the very contract which they had signed their names to. Eventually, the company agreed to their demands and settled miscellaneous health and safety items, the health and safety items being a sham. Go look it up, it was in all the papers, bottom of the page. The company then just raised prices and went from there. That doesn't work in the long term, and everybody knows that too. The most historic thing about this strike is that it's actually legal. But it involves all three companies, they say. Really? That's so breathtaking? But all three is just a tiny minority of the car companies. Everybody builds cars in the US now. Toyota, Nissan, Honda, Subaru, Volkswagen, and others all build cars in the US. And while the big three are all headquartered in Michigan, none of the foreign manufacturers has a single plant in Michigan. Also, none of the foreign car companies are unionized. Not here anyway. They are in their home countries where our cars can't be sold. That's got to make you think. But the union and its strike has no direct impact on any of those auto workers, comprising most of the actual auto workers by far in the US. If you disagree with anything in this video, references are listed in the description. Please like and subscribe while you're at it. The big three used to make their own components. After that historic 1998 strike, the last components divisions were sold off. None of the companies making these components now, whether wheels, wire, or weather stripping, are unionized. So now the UAW only has 150,000 members or so in the million-man U.S. auto industry. Before all the illegal strikes, GM alone employed more than half that many, or 80,000, just in one town, Flint, back in the 1980s. There are only about 4,000 there now. So not only are there only a tiny fraction of the auto workers even affected by the strike, the UAW seems to be doing little to keep any Americans employed, let alone Michiganders. So it's not very historic, and not really auto workers. What are the issues? They say they want more money. They say that the two-tier pay system is unfair, and that the executives and companies make lots of money. That's comparing apples to cow pies. Yes, Mary Barra is having a good year, but her pay goes up and down. Only the union is guaranteed future pay raises. Mary Barra's salary is $2.1 million, chicken feed on the CEO scale, and the exact same salary Rick Wagner received in 2008. Plus stock options, true, but in Wagner's case, those options went to zero. How soon we forget. That's the same deal Barra has. I'm no great fan of Mary Barra, but I don't understand a workforce and press who criticizes her for getting paid to do her job based on her performance and merely cashing in on it as agreed. The same company was bankrupt 14 short years ago, and look at them now. But then, from a union with a history of striking against its own contract as agreed, maybe that's not surprising. So why would anyone support them? On comparisons that are relevant, non-union Toyota outsold GM in 2021. That's bad news. Tesla pays $45 an hour in labor costs compared to GM's $75. That's really bad news. And Tesla's market cap versus the Detroit 3 is well known. But leave it to the press and the union to come up with an irrelevant statistic about how much Barra makes, a barometer. Apparently, the 7 deadly sins, including envy, are good motivators. So it's not auto workers, it's not historic, and it's also not really a strike. Why not? Because a strike is when workers band together and march out the door in unity, making a huge sacrifice to force the company to pay a fair wage. Well, they're already getting a fair wage, but never mind that. They're not all marching out, and most are giving up very little, and none are giving up everything. Number one, only 13,000 workers went on strike, less than 10% of the UAW at the Big Three. 91% of the workers stayed on the job. They call it a targeted strike, closing some plants to affect the entire company. We'll see. Back in 1998, again, they stopped production of spark plugs at General Motors. In previous years, they targeted taillights and brake light production. Each time, the same thing happened. The strikes were illegal, but they stopped work throughout the whole company. The rest of the workforce not on strike got rewarded with nearly full pay for the duration of the strike because they weren't technically on strike. Then the two sides settled, and eventually the striking workers lost their jobs and the plants closed. A year later, the entire components group, then named Delphi, was sold off, went bankrupt, and scores of plants closed with tens of thousands of UAW jobs moving offshore. The union calls this success. Now, however, the strikers have few component plants to attack. So they went after assembly plants, but there's a problem with that. Assembly plants don't supply anyone else. Advantage, Big Three, and the union knows it. But Wentzville supplies stamped parts to Fairfax, shutting them down, you say. Good point for several reasons. First, it's no big deal. Most assembly plants have their own stamping operation. You can bet that right now at GM there are two allocation engineers talking, and one is saying, "I told you we shouldn't have mixed up the plant's work and kept it separate." Meanwhile, look for the trucks to move the tooling, the dies, for those parts the few miles from Wentzville back to Fairfax, where production will begin again. Or maybe not, because the whole strike is a joke. I mean, why did they choose the three plants they did? They struck the Jeep plant in Toledo probably as a distraction from Mary Barra's salary to punish Stellantis, since the former head of Stellantis made almost twice her compensation while not working there at all. So there's no Jeeps for the time being. They struck Wentzville, Missouri, spilling over into Fairfax. Wentzville builds the Colorado and Canyon smaller pickups, the ones you don't know anyone who drives one. Fairfax builds the Chevy Malibu, the only sedan Chevrolet makes anymore because they can't sell cars. Not much of a target in either plant. Makes you wonder if GM got to pick the strike targets themselves. And the third plant, a Ford assembly plant building the Bronco and Ranger. Two more small trucks. Notice a pattern here? None of the shutdowns affects the production of the moneymakers, the F-150, the Silverado, and the Ram. And none of them affect electric vehicles. Why not strike those assembly plants or their suppliers? Instead of Toledo Assembly, why not Toledo Powertrain, where the EV motors are built? Why not the engine or transmission plants? Why not the foundries? Why not the new battery plants? None of the three shutdowns seriously hurts the company's futures. It's not a real strike in either quality or quantity. Speaking of quantity, you realize the UAW is not the United Auto Workers. It's the United Auto, Aerospace, and Agricultural Equipment Workers, a union which has 400,000 members. How is it there are only 160,000 that are actual auto workers? That's the decline which the union has led. The auto workers used to be the largest share. More important, where are the statements from the UAW workers at John Deere supporting this strike? Deere employees went on strike in 2021. 30% of their employees went out, 3 times the auto worker ratio. They came back to work with a 401k retirement plan and a 2-tier system. They're making an average of $22 an hour. Where's the support of the UAW workers in the aerospace industry, many of whom are in Michigan? And what about the other unions in Michigan? Michigan is a strong union state, just voted out right to work last November. You have to join the union by law in Michigan if you want a job. And the Detroit Three are all, well, in Detroit, Michigan. So here's two strong unions. There have been several nurses' strikes in Michigan in 2023. Anyone heard of the nurses coming out to support the auto workers? Any of the current striking nurses marching on the UAW picket lines? What about the teachers? Michigan has a strong teachers union, and Detroit schools are famous for their strikes and sickouts, despite strikes being illegal for most of recent history. They threatened to strike in August. Have the teachers and their union come out in favor of the strike? You can support the American worker and the auto worker 100%, but why would you support a strike that no one else seems to support? With all the televised interviews of picketers, why no interviews of workers at Toyota, John Deere, and Martin Northrop? Why no interviews of nurses and teachers? Maybe this will help. The auto workers say they are just trying to scrape by under all the inflation which they voted for when they endorsed Joe Biden. Well, here's the poverty level they want to escape. Here's what a temporary employee makes. This is someone brought in from Kelly Services, say, to flexibly fill a labor gap. Here's what a new hire makes. This is what they mean when they speak of the unfair two-tier system. But he's making pretty close to this, the average line worker pay at Toyota. The UAW would say Toyota workers should unionize. But teachers are unionized, and here's what they pay new teachers in Michigan. This is the average teacher pay. We keep going up, but we still have not seen what the senior UAW workers earn. Here's that number. The senior hubcap hanger makes significantly more than the average teacher, and not much less than the highest salary a teacher can get, shown here. We talked about nurses. Here's the average nurse's pay in Michigan, more than that UAW employee. But after that UAW employee gets the 20% pay raise already offered and pretty much guaranteed, the high UAW worker will be paid more than the average nurse, and they're demanding a 40% raise. So maybe that's why the nurses and teachers are not featured predominantly on TV. If that's not enough, here's one more reason. When teachers and nurses go on strike, it's a real strike. All of them leave, and none of them get paid. The final reason this is not a historic strike is because built into the price of every American car is something called strike pay. You're paying for the workers supposedly on strike to be paid as well. And that's at a rate equivalent to $26,000 a year for walking the picket line or working on their deer blind or whatever they choose to do. The news says 54% of the public supports the strikers according to their surveys. It's easy to reply yes to the survey, but out of 14 million cars sold last year, only 21% of them were built by the UAW. The public claims to support the union, but won't buy the cars they build. So unless the customers, teachers, nurses, and other UAW workers say so, it's not historic, not auto workers, and not a strike.